That was me in 2021 when I experienced ego death, and it was the most liberating but also most horrible and disruptive thing that could have ever happened to me. So what exactly is ego death, and why do so many people find it desirable? Hello friends, welcome to my channel where I talk about anything and everything with a mindful twist. Ego death. A big and hot topic these days. If you're already familiar with this concept, I'll get straight to the point. You can go on right ahead and skip to part 2 where I discuss the truths. And if you're new, don't worry, I got you. We'll do a little ego/ego death intro 101 before I debunk this ego death myth. I wanted to discuss this topic because 1, I practically talked about it in every video that I've mentioned my own experience, so it's about goddamn time. And 2, as research on psychedelics has continued to prosper in the context of mental health and psychotherapy, the ego and therefore the death of it has become a hot topic. And in some odd turn of events, ego death has almost become the next billion-dollar experience in the wellness and spiritual community. So what is the ego anyways? I think when we toss the word ego around in casual conversations, we usually think of it in terms of egotistical or those who have big egos, like mediocre men who think they're entitled to way too much, or the pop divas who slay and serve but from time to time serve unnecessary shade. But contrary to that perception, all of us in some shape or form have an ego, whether we are egotistical or not. It really has nothing to do with hubris or excessive pride. The word ego was a term indirectly coined by Sigmund Freud, who in originally German text called it das Ich, which translated to English means the I. And over time, ego has become the synonymous English translation with the I. So essentially, the ego is your self-concept, that core sense of you-ness when you ask yourself, who am I? It's your ethos, your point of view, and the values that you embody. In essence, if you're to ask yourself, who am I? You would most likely draw from things like your personality, your appearances, your belief systems, and your titles like mom or lawyer or student, which are all influenced by a mix of innate nature and nurture, whether that be familial, social, or cultural. The ego is what helps guides us day to day and thinks in absolute terms like all drugs are bad, or Beyonce can do no wrong, or I am the best at my job. It's what helps give you a sense of identity in this world so you can find your place within it. And at the core of the ego or the I, self-interest is always at play. The ego prompts us to always ask ourselves, what am I doing or what do I want? To piece the little clues in our lives to form that whole picture of who we think we are. So now that you have a better understanding of the ego, let's talk about the death of it, or the ego death, and why it's such hot these days. Ego death in simple terms is really just a lack of I. For those who have experienced it, including myself, learn that all the things that you think you are really just fabrications and tale of our times, like Santa Claus until the age of 6 or 7, or I don't know, never believed in him. Like you aren't really Tiger Mom or Average Joe or Emily in Paris the way that you think you are. Ego death is what breaks those self-concepts that you have spent all your life building and realizing that at the end of the day, those are all just stories and narratives that we come up either with ourselves or have been told by others to ensure our emotional and physical safety and place in this world. And that at the end of the day, we all humans are actually more similar than we are different. Aww. So if you're new to this concept, you might be thinking, what the actual? That sounds horrible. Why would anyone want that? And that's when we have to talk about the troubles our little or big ego gets us into. In short, the ego with its absolute black and white thinking causes us to suffer because we get so fixated on what we think brings us happiness as a result of who we think we are that when we don't get those things, we get anxious or even fall into depression. In simple terms, Buddhist teachings call this upadana, or our attachments, where the ego attaches concepts of happiness to a compass, always thinking that happiness is out there rather than here. And thinking that, for example, we need to achieve certain milestones, have certain experiences, or be super hot in order to make our I or perceive our sense of self happy. In the ego's terms, without those concrete pursuits, it loses its solid place in the world and starts spiraling into whatever mental health issue you want to name. So in this context, ego death has become such a prized experience because a lack of ego implies a lack of attachments and therefore theoretically a lack of problems and therefore an abundance of peace and happiness. Sounds pretty good, right? In the West, ego death is pretty much synonymous with using psychedelics and sometimes psychotherapy to achieve that state or experience. For example, a cognitive study conducted in 2016 titled Ego Dissolution and Psychedelics, Validation of the Ego Dissolution Inventory. Scientifically, validation validated the concept of ego death but could only do so in the context of psychedelic substances. But in the East, ego death is nothing new, as for example, Buddhism has taught it in the form of enlightenment and awakening for over 2,000 years. And the path to this includes examining the self, contemplating Buddhist teachings, and practicing mindfulness and meditation to over time detach from the egoic self. Personally for me, it was a culmination of the later where I rigorously questioned my upbringing, my traumas, my life teachings, and accidentally triggered the state, which, mind you, I actually wasn't trying to pursue. But this video isn't about how to achieve ego death, and I'll go into why now with the 4 truths that people don't talk about, so you aren't in for a shock and blindsided by the supposedly blissful experience. And that's exactly truth number 1, that ego death can be extremely unpleasant. In the Western context of ego death, many often speak about the blissful experiencing and realizing that you really are everything and everywhere all at once, and that life in nature is so much grander and wiser than what meets the human eye. And of course, this is all in the context of a high or a trip, a state of mind that is really outside of your day-to-day perceptions, which is where the narrative of bliss derives from. But as we just talked about, when ego death implies shattering that mirror that represents all that you've known all your life, the bliss comes hand in hand with extreme confusion and disorientation afterwards. When I had this breakthrough realization, it threw me into a spiral where all of a sudden the 25 years worth of conditioning and life experiences felt like a lie, like one big illusion. Like when you found out that Santa Claus as a kid was actually not real and you end up feeling betrayed by your parents. You start reflecting back on all your life lessons and all those experiences and identities that you thought were you, and start wondering, where have I been all my life? And why does society teach us one lie after another? And who were those wise sisters behind the Matrix? Hint, they were really onto something. And especially since this is a path that is still nowhere near mainstream's pulse, it really takes a lot of investigating and digging to find other like-minded people, Reddit users, and teachers who speak about this. And when the subject is so abstract and the experience varies so drastically from person to person, it really takes a long marination period for that profoundness to sink in and for you to accept that this new chapter of your life is one huge undertaking, and that it will stick with you for the rest of your life, and that to embark on this path means being lost over and over again, like you're forever in that forest in The Wizard of Oz. Of course, the bliss is there, and you experience life through a new lens, almost like you're a newborn. But again, that also does mean with a new perspective, a new filter, that you also have to grieve your past life and take the time to make sense of this new human experience. And for me, that actually took a solid 4 to almost 5 months before I rediscovered the solid grounds to fully embody the unwavering peace that ego death introduced into my life. The second truth is that the ego doesn't really die. When people talk about ego death, they usually talk about it like it's final, it's done, ciao, let's have a funeral and move on type of death. But to be human and still have a physical body and a life ahead of us, the myth that the ego dies is really just that, one big myth. In the beginning of the video, you saw that I used a balloon to represent the ego, and a deflated one, or uninflated depending on how you look at it, to represent ego death. When you experience ego death, the structure of the ego is still there, just collapsed and less prominent. Less like a dictator and more like a pet you have to tend to. You might become less reliant on expectations and outcomes to find happiness and peace, but you are still in some shape or form you. And to have a human experience means still needing to manage the ego so it doesn't try to inflate itself from time to time or pick up its poop, if you want to continue that pet metaphor. In essence, it's not like you have an ego death experience and all of a sudden, poof, you're gone. Or you suddenly wake up and have long hair and look like Jesus, or have very little of it and look like an enlightened monk. And mind you, even the monks practice their mindfulness and meditation for the rest of their lives, no matter how enlightened they are. Through mindfulness and grounding yourself in perhaps a more simple and thoughtful life, you learn how to slowly chip away the remains of the collapsed structure, but also know that it will always still be there, and that sometimes egoic relapses are inevitable. And that's because we've been through so many years worth of societal teachings that tell us to do this or believe that or behave this way, that our roots will take years to replenish itself with more wholesome roots. So really, the ego cannot be destroyed or dissolved to nothingness. Those are all just fictions or attempts to dismiss our human conditioning. The third truth is that ego death is not for everyone. I ultimately do think that ego death / enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, is for everyone, but what I mean here is that it's not for everyone in this current moment. Thought you almost caught me backtracking, huh? In Mark Epstein's book, The Trauma of Everyday Life, which I'll link below, Mark explores the links between psychology psychology and Buddhism, and how those two disciplines can complement one another to aid in improved mental health and spiritual healing. He doesn't specifically talk about ego death, but hints at it when he talks about selflessness, and one sentence I particularly love states, "To understand selflessness, you first have to find that self that we take to be so real, the one that feels traumatized, entangled in the tangle." Essentially, ego death is not suitable for those who have very surface understandings of their own ego. As I said in truth number 1, ego death can be incredibly disorienting, and without some sort of groundwork, whether that's through introspection or through therapy or extensive spiritual work, the experience can easily thrust some into perpetual depression or existentialism, and that actually becomes more harmful than beneficial. You ultimately have to have a healthy understanding and relationship with your ego for ego death to be digestible. If you're still fighting a war with it on the daily, like how you still won't shut up about your ex 2 years later, or still find yourself unclear why you always react the same way in the same situation, then it's probably not for you. I understand that for many of us who have experienced traumas or have mental health roadblocks, that sometimes the promise of healing and bliss is very attractive. But attempting to destroy or kill off our egos prematurely is 1, not giving enough credit for how the ego has served us and kept us safe for the number of years we have been alive for, and 2, self-destruction. We all know that self-destructiveness, well, is not constructive, and attempting to kill off our egos when you value it so little to begin with is just another form of that. It's almost like giving our hearts to a lover that we already knew would be not good for us, but did it anyways knowing that we're in for a ride. Probably an unpleasant one. Ultimately, if you've come across ego death or are just now acquainting yourself with it and find it appealing, know that there will be a time when ego death does become appropriate. But for now, be kind to yourself, continue to do the groundwork, and I'll touch on this more in the last part of the video. The final truth is that ego death is not moral superiority. This one is probably the most abstract and niche one, so I won't harp on it too much, but I think can really apply to any psychological or spiritual progression you make in your personal life. When you're given a glimpse of the true nature of this life and can see past the conditionings that many of us were raised with, it almost feels like being let in on a secret that not many know about. And I was certainly guilty of this for a bit, and also sometimes deduce from people's tone who have experienced ego death as well, that there's this moral superiority, that you're almost better and know better because you've had this experience. So to all my friends who heard me preach between March to June of 2021, this is my public YouTuber apology. But at the end of the day, ego death is just another human concept and construct to help us clarify our existence. And ego death really is just another experience. To attach our identities and derive worth from a defining moment is just another scheme of our ego, and actually a sign that we haven't fully learned from the experience and actually detracts from what it is trying to teach us. To let go of our attachments and our sense of self so that we can find the peace and the happiness that is often clouded by our need to define or brand ourselves. And like I said, this can really apply to any progress you make on a personal level. To remind yourself that knowing more because perhaps you have been to therapy or know the ins and outs of social justice or have had spiritual experiences does not make you more worthy to disparage and diminish other people's experiences and their own path to happiness. So now that you have Professor Matt's rundown on the 4 truths on the ego death, let's touch on what it is that you can do in place of ego death, because as I mentioned, it can be incredibly abrupt and disorienting and really isn't for everyone to pursue depending on where you are in life. And the key here is to be mindful of the ego. If this was your first time thinking about ego beyond the context of big egos and egotistical, then the first step is to identify what you think makes you you, and contemplate where those beliefs come from and whether they actually still serve you. One of ego's inclination is to be that dictator, feeding you constant negative self-talk or locking you down to fixed identities and personality traits that also lock you out of the boundless joys in life. And we don't even realize it's actually the ego at play. When you can start naming your ego's personalities, where he, she, they gets its sources, then you will slowly and mindfully chip away the ego's main motivator, which is fear, to ensure your emotional survival and place in this world. And if you take a kinder approach and slowly challenge its assumptions, you'll find that a lot of your ego sources aren't actually as trustworthy as you make them to be, like TMZ or New York Times on a bad day, or even a little Fox News sprinkled in there. We were told many things from a young age that we believed to be true, even if those labels or judgy comments were nowhere near who we actually are. And the ego continues to use those information as hard truths for us to navigate our lives. But being mindful of the ego busts its sinister sources, shines light on them, and slowly you learn to let go of ideas that aren't actually making you peaceful and happy. And yes, that may mean doing that with a teacher or therapist or through extensive introspection work. It all depends on what works best for you. But what matters most is being honest with yourself, painting a picture of that ego and identifying its motivators and perceived ideas of happiness so you can slowly let go of non-serving attachments attachments and really understand that your true essence is not your ego. And just one final note, as if I haven't preached enough already, as you continue to do the inner work, remember that your ego, though fear-driven, is also not your enemy. And that as you deepen your knowledge as a wise adult who knows how to nurture yourself, it also means nourishing the ego so you have a healthier and more detached relationship with it, not something you want to destruct. Because at the end of the day, it really is something that is indestructible, though deflatable, and will always continue to be a character in your life. Alright friends, my ego needs a little tending to after I've talked about it extensively. My ego and I would appreciate a like and subscribe or even a share if you dare. And until then, you got this. Till next time.